Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to the Navia pre-release analysis. Now, I want to preface this by saying Navia got a pretty big buff from her first iteration in the beta to her current state. I'll talk about the buff and its impact and everything else that we usually do in the pre-releases, so let's just get right into it. But before we do, I usually say this at the end of the video, but do the like, do the subscribe, do all the good stuff, do the YouTube thingies. Actually, I shouldn't even tell you guys to subscribe because I know that every single one of you guys is already subscribed, right? Anyways, let's get into it. We start with her stats. I guess lately I've been caring a little bit more about the base stats because here's the thing. The actual base attack, it doesn't matter because this is just one of the factors being different, which leads to the end result of her damage, which I look at in a vacuum anyways, right? I look at the damage at the end because that's what matters. So the actual base attack, it doesn't really matter that much because characters with lower base attack can have higher motion values and you can't really derive anything from that. However, the base defense and base HP, that has started to matter a lot more recently because they have started more and more to design enemies that are designed around killing you, just making sure that you die. And I know that there's a lot of people that don't like it, and there's some elements to it that I think are not great, but there's also some elements that are pretty good about it. And I want to talk a little bit about that. To some extent, it started with the consecrated beasts, but I think the consecrated beasts weren't that bad. It's just that when you put two enemies, it's harder than when there's only one. And that was a pretty big deal, but their attacks were still fairly telegraphed and not too hard to dodge for the most part. And so I think it really became a much more significant thing with the release of this boss. Icewind Sweet, Dirge of Coppelia. This enemy does a lot of damage repeatedly in a way that is not that telegraphed, and which forces you to dash a lot if you actually want to dodge the damage. To the extent where, in a lot of situations, most players will find it easier to just wait out the periods where she's doing a lot of damage, or maybe play range characters so you don't have to deal with the melee parts of that damage. And she actually does enough damage that with Zhongli, you can't just ignore it. Even a full HP build, like shield build Zhongli, if you're not dodging any of the hits, your shield will die and then you will die. I think that's good, but it definitely does add this element of conferring a certain importance to survivability, which matters a lot in Navia's case because she's Geo. So very often you're going to play her maybe with other defensive units because a lot of the Geo supports are a bit more defensive focused. I mean, inherently you're going to get, and we're going to see later, her kit is centered to some extent around Crystallize. So you're going to get Crystallizes, which are going to help your survivability. And also, her base defensive stats are pretty high, right? If you look at characters by HP, so like the first like on-fielder that is like truly nothing to do with his actual HP scaling in this list is a Hytham at 13.3k. And if you look at Navia's base HP, it's less than 1,000 less. And if you look at character defense, off-fielder defense doesn't matter as much because they're spending less time on field. So on-fielders, there is Sino that has higher. That is not a defense scaler. Child, Kutsing, Chao, and that's it. So she's not the highest, but at least pretty close to some of the highest, both in terms of base HP and base defense, which is going to give her, paired with the fact that she triggers Crystallize, and as we'll see when we talk about her teams, synergizes fairly well with units like Zhongli. It's going to give her an inherent survivability that is going to be pretty nice. So some of you guys might not know this because survivability has been such an afterthought in Genshin for such a long time. But when it comes to shield damage, the damage that your shield takes is exactly the same as what your character would have taken with an asterisk, which is that like if you look at the shield as like, oh, it has shield strength, that means the shield has a bigger number, not that the shield is more resistant to damage, right? If you look at things that increase your shield's strength as making your shield bigger, then your shield is taking as much damage as your character is, which means the character's defense will affect how much damage your shield is taking, which means that characters with higher base defense will have an easier time taking less damage on their shields. So the fact that she has fairly high base defense is pretty nice when it comes to the crystallized shields and potential Zhongli shields that she'll be having. All this to say, it makes survivability matter a bit more, and Navia has fairly high base defensive stats, and she's Geo, which means that she's actually going to be one of the most tanky non-HP scalers when it comes to on-fielders. And that's something that isn't going to be reflected in her damage output and the things we're going to talk about for the rest of the pre-release, so I wanted to get it out of the way early because it does matter at the end of the day. Other than that, crit ascension, it's nice. Moving on to what she actually does. Her normal attacks are normal attacks. We don't have to read them, they're normal attacks. As we'll see later, she gets a Geo Infusion from a part of her kit. So when it comes to these numbers, having looked at how fast they come out, these are decent numbers. The easiest way to like put into perspective what this is this is pretty similar to what Diluc does, which means it is good damage that you can get if you want to spend field time on her, but it's not so much damage that you necessarily want to actually spam her normal attacks. Elemental skill, Ceremonial Crystal Shot. When a character in the party obtains an elemental shard created from the Crystallize reaction, Navia will gain 1 Crystal Shrapnel charge. And Navia can hold up to 6 charges of Crystal Shrapnel at once. Each time Crystal Shrapnel gain is triggered, the duration of the Crystal Shrapnel charges you already have will be reset. They last for 300 seconds, which means that effectively, you're not losing charges unless you can go AFK for 5 minutes. When she fires, Navia will consume all Crystal Shrapnel charges and open her elegant yet lethal Gunbrella, firing multiple Rosula shards that can penetrate opponents, dealing geo damage to opponents' hit. When 0, 1, 2, or 3 or more charges of Crystal Shrapnel are consumed, 5, 7, 9, 11 Rosula shard shots will be fired respectively. The more shard shots that strike a single opponent, the greater the damage dealt to them. When all 11 strike, 200% of the original damage is dealt. In addition, when more than 3 charges are consumed, every charge consumed beyond these 3 will increase the damage dealt by this Gunbrella shot by an additional 15%. In the hold, enter aiming mode, collect elemental shards around you from Crystallize. When released, it basically does the skill tap. 2 initial uses, and this part matters a lot. And it also has Uzia, but that doesn't matter. To simplify, every time you trigger Crystallize, you gain a stack. And her skill does more damage based on the amount of stacks that you have. It's basically a shotgun, so enemies that are close range will take the full damage. Enemies that are further away, based on where they are, might take more or less. And based on the footage for the hold version, you can basically like short hold and release it instantly, just to like aim where you want it to be. Like you're not gonna have to deal with auto-targeting bullshit with this, which is nice, right? That's what the hold version effectively does, is it lets you ignore the auto-targeting bullshit, and that's really cool. Now, the stacks, right? Initially you fire 5 shots, right? Basically 5 bullets. And based on the amount of stacks that you have, you fire more bullets. As far as I understand, it's still the same spread, but it goes from 5 shards to 11 shards. And it's double damage if you have 11 than if you have 5, which means that you probably have a base damage at 5 and it goes up by 16.6% per additional bullet that's hitting. Or maybe the base damage is from even if only 1 shard hits and you gain 10% damage per additional shard that's hitting. I'm not entirely sure about that. Either way though, this damage increase is significant and it's not too hard to gain these stacks, which means you really want to max out, at the very least, the amount of bullets you're firing. If you have 3 stacks, you fire the maximum amount of bullets, and if you have more than 3, then each additional stack is 15 damage percent, basically. The base damage is 671.2 at talent level 9, which means it's 1342.4 if all bullets hit. That's a lot. That's a big number. And she can hold 2 uses. She can hold 2 charges. So her gameplay pattern is effectively collect shards, swap into her, do the big number, then her Ascension 4. After using her skill, her normal attacks, charge, and plunge attacks will be converted to geo damage, and damage will be increased. So fire for your first skill, get your elemental conversion, do a bunch of attacks, get more crystallizes, and then fire your second skill. And because you can hold 2 charges, you don't have to wait all the 9-second cooldown. You can fire both of them in a 5-ish second period. This number, if you just look at it, is big. 1300 twice, that's big. But do keep in mind, her normal attacks are still not insane, right? They're pretty similar to Diluc's without reactions, right? And as we're gonna get into, her burst is all right also. You kind of need to use it in order to generate your shards, but the actual damage that it does is nice, right? But it's not like an insanely huge deal. And so just because this number is pretty high, that doesn't mean like, wow, Omega broken character. Oh, and also obviously you have the Uzia damage, which is an additional 60 emotional value, which isn't like all that big, but it is better than not having it. Elemental burst, as the sunlit skies singing salute. On the orders of the the president of the Spina di Rosula. Call for a magnificent Rosula Dorada salute. Unleashes a massive cannon bombardment on opponents in front of her, dealing AoE geo damage and providing cannon fire support for a duration afterwards, periodically dealing geo damage to nearby opponents. When cannon attacks hit opponents, Navia will gain 1 charge of crystal shrapnel, 1 charge of her skill. Not like charge as in like the 1 use of her skill, but like 1 stack of her skill. This effect can only be triggered once every 2.4 seconds. It hits, if I remember correctly, 16 times over these 12 seconds. That's a hit every, what, 0.75 seconds? So you get a stack every 4 hits, I think? Now, because you need to actually trigger Crystallize or get this thing to get your stacks, in a lot of situations what you're going to end up doing is you're not going to do like the usual skill burst or burst skill right back to back that you do on a lot of characters. You're going to do something more akin to what I usually do on Xingqiu, which is use your burst, swap out, set up your buffs, go back to her, and then use your skill. On top of that, it does not snapshot, which means that there's no reason to use it before your buffs. I mean, technically, if you could just stay on her, use burst, and then stay on her for the whole burst duration, then there would be a reason, but it's not a huge incentive to use it before you use your buffs. The energy cost is 60. Her particle generation on her skill, if I understand correctly, is 3 to 4, 50-50, so 3.5 on average. You generate about 7 particles per rotation. When you look at the ER requirements that leaves you with, in solo Geo, they tend to be fairly high. In double Geo, they tend to be a lot more manageable. On top of that, in double Geo, it's a lot easier to generate more crystallized shards. From what I've seen, I think it'll be doable to get at least 3 per skill as a solo Geo from crystallizes plus the ones you get from the burst for your first one. And then for your second one, the additional crystallizes that you get from the normal attack infusion plus the burst will also make it 3 without too much of an issue. But you're unlikely to actually max it out at 6, right? You're probably going to get 3 or 4 in solo Geo, and then in double Geo, 5 or 6. Which basically just means a little bit more damage percent on it. It's not as big of a deal as getting those first 3, but it's still nice. Anyways, all this to say, she has fairly decent synergy with running 2 Geo units. You get Geo Resonance, which is really good for Geo characters because it's Geo Resistance Shred. You get potentially more particle generation if you're running a Geo unit that generates energy. And I say that because we're also going to talk about teams where you use her with Noelle, who does not generate energy. But yeah, you can justify running her in either, but I do think that it's overall generally going to be better to run her in a team that has 2 Geo units. Now, last part of her passive that I haven't talked about, I guess there's 2. 25% more rewards when dispatched on Fontaine expeditions. Mutual Assistance Network. For each Pyro, Electro, Cryo, or Hydro party member, Navia gains 20% increased attack. This effect can stack up to 2 times. This is an incentive to run her with non-Geo characters, but honestly, she doesn't even need this incentive because like you need to trigger Crystallize anyways. You wouldn't want to run her in a mono Geo team to begin with. And as we're gonna talk about, she also doesn't have great synergy with like 3 Geo character teams. So basically this is in most situations just a free 40% attack, which is nice. Another thing I want to talk about is her upcoming artifact set, because there is an artifact set coming out for her. Nighttime Whispers in the Echoing Woods. 2-piece, 18% attack. 4-piece, after using a skill, gain 20% Geo damage. As far as I understand, for Navia, you do gain it for the skill itself because it deals damage after you use it. While under a shield granted by the Crystallize reaction, the above effect will be increased by 150%, and this additional increase disappears 1 second after that shield is lost. Because I think in most situations you're going to do short hold rather than tap on the E, and because the short hold absorbs nearby Crystallize shards, I think in almost every situation you will be able to get a Crystallize shard right before your E damage goes off. So you'll be able to pretty reliably get this increase. Now, this is not 150% additional damage percent. This is this 20% being multiplied by 2.5 up to 50%. So it's 18% attack and 50% damage bonus that is conditional upon using skill. Obviously, this doesn't apply to a part of her burst because she, in my opinion, in most situations, will tend to use her burst at the very start of her rotations before she uses her skill. So a part of her burst damage won't benefit from this, like this damage at all. A part of it will as well, because it doesn't snapshot though. And then a part of her normal attacks might not benefit from the increase on it, so only get the 20% rather than 50, because if you don't immediately like catch your other crystallizes, right? They can be generated maybe under a boss's hitbox or a little bit too far and you don't think to pick it up or whatever, or it's not worth dashing to pick it up. Then the later part of her normal attacks, after she uses the first skill, will only get the 20% rather than the 50%. Yeah, so on average, this isn't actually 50% geo damage. It's more like 35 to 40. It's the equivalent of that, at least, when you look at her overall damage profile, which is still pretty nice. Like, it's still good. It is going to be her best in slot in teams where you can't run Marechaussee because she doesn't have great other options, right? Like, technically you could run Golden Troop, but your second E likely wouldn't benefit from the increased after swapping out. It also doesn't benefit your normal attack and burst damage. And as much as her skill is her bread and butter, over a whole rotation, her burst and normal attacks are still a relevant portion of her damage. Her burst is like about 55-ish% of her damage in a 2-skill 4 normal attack rotation, which I think is going to be the default, which means there's still a pretty significant portion of your damage that is not skill damage, which is part of the reason why Golden Troop isn't great. There's just no other great artifact set that works incredibly well with her if you don't have Farina on the team. Now, there are going to be teams where you can play her with Farina, and in those teams, obviously, Marechaussee is going to be real good. But yeah, so I think overall it's really mostly her signature, Marechaussee if you're playing her in Farina teams, or a 2-piece while you're trying to get her signature set. Anyways, we'll get also into more information on teams later on in the team section, but before we start getting into the usual like weapon counts and stuff like that, I do want to very briefly mention, I think that on release, there's going to be like 2 teams where she's pretty good. I think she's going to be pretty good with a Bennett Xiangling core. It is a team where you can benefit from higher field time on your supports because it lets you battery Xiangling more, generate more energy for her, lower her ER requirements, which is nice. If you're playing double Geo in a Bennett Xiangling core with maybe like Zhongli, it is one of the very rare teams where you actually have the time in your rotation to use Zhongli's burst, and you might actually even be able to use Zhongli's burst while Bennett's burst is still up. I think that's the first one, and I think the second one is a Farina team where you probably play like a healer build Bennett with Farina. I think it'll be fine if you use another healer, but I think healer build Bennett is probably the best play. And because Navia has shorter field time, it does allow for you to actually swap into your support while your Bennett buff is active and actually get that healing, right? Because that's one of the biggest potential issues in Bennett Farina teams is that you don't really have the time in your rotation to swap into your teammates to heal them without losing uptime on your carry if you're playing a character that has a longer field time, right? So that's a way that she can synergize pretty well with that. Some of you guys might not actually know this, but if you go to the URL of a character on Project Amber, after the number in the URL, you do _0, it brings you to the first version of a character. I find this to be pretty useful to talk about buffs and nerfs that happen to beta characters. Let's talk about this buff. So effectively, because you really want to get at least 3 stacks, her motion value on skill basically went from 1,040 to 1,340. You got 300 motion value on your skill. That's a really big deal. And I'd say that before this buff, her overall state was fairly disappointing. I mean, I tweeted about her state before the buff. I said that I was pretty disappointed with her. The main reason for that is her playstyle effectively revolves around swapping into her, staying on her for a short-ish period of time, front-loading all of her damage, and then swapping off. If a character that is doing that does similar damage per time on field, right? Like their DPS while they're on field is similar to a character that can stay for longer, then why are you playing them over that character? What's the point of playing a character focused around front-loaded damage if the damage you're front-loading is the same amount as you would get with a character that doesn't front-load their damage? And that's the issue with a character like Ningguang, for example, which is she doesn't reach the threshold where it's better to use her than a character that actually has good damage over a longer period of time with her front-loaded damage. And I think in this state pre-buff, she did reach a point where she was doing a bit more damage than other characters you could slot into the teams where she's gonna end up slotting, but just barely, to the point where it felt like it just wasn't a character. Because, okay, let me try to explain this a little bit better. Imagine if while Ayaka used her burst, she did similar DPS to Risley, or maybe just a tiny bit better, right? While her burst is going, while having more team building issues or like requirements, and not being able to maintain that for a longer period of time. There wouldn't be a real point to her over Risley. And that's the issue I had with this iteration of Navia, was that it kind of felt like if you take Ayaka and you nerf the out of her burst to make it so that while she's on field, she just does slightly more damage than a character that is designed around longer field times. And this buff, it overcame that obstacle. It made it so that, I mean, she's still not an insanely strong character, far from it, but it made her value go from, like, you don't get much more out of using her on field than using another character that could be used there, to, oh, okay, if there is a situation where I have like 8-ish seconds in my rotation that I can spend on a character because I'm using supports that require more field time, there is a reason to use her over the other options. Now, problem with this is that that's not the case. There's no team that exists right now that would synergize well with her kit while having that, oh, I have a decent amount of time that I could be spending on a non-fielder, but not so much that I want to use a dedicated carry. Because there are teams that have that situation, but they're just not teams where she would slot in particularly well. As of right now, I'd say that the only teams that really have that dynamic going on are the Quicken teams with Yai and or Kutsane, or even with Raiden to some extent, where you have field time you can afford to spend because a character like Yai, right, you use your triple E, then later in your rotation you use your burst and another triple E, and overall that's like 6-7 seconds spent on her. But her normal and charge attacks aren't great. They're fine to use if you don't have anything else to do, but if you had something you could be doing, you'd rather do that. It's a character that has the ability to let you spend time on a short field time carry. The problem is, it's really hard to slot in a character like Navia in those Quicken teams because they're a reaction-based team that relies on specific elements and often just have better synergy with either other Electro or Animo or Dendro characters. However, this is a quote-unquote problem that is not permanent. If they want to start releasing characters that have the ability to let you spend time on short field time carries, they have to start somewhere. And at the end of the day, as much as a good portion of Yai's damage comes from off field, I think in most teams, she ends up playing like a short field time carry. She spends about 6-7 seconds of the rotation on field because of her long animations if you want to triple E, and you have to do it more than once, and you have to use your burst, which also has a fairly long animation, which means that the best type of character that short field time carries synergize with is other short field time carries. What I'm getting at here is, if Navia came out while Navia was already out, if there was already a Navia in the game and Navia came out, both of those Navias would become significantly stronger. Navia's best teammate would be herself. Pretty similar to how people often very much like playing Xingqiu with Yelan, because a kit like Xingqiu's and Yelan's just synergizes really well with itself. Navia's kit synergizes really well with itself. But if they want to start releasing characters that work with short field time carries, they have to release short field time carries, and one of them has to be the first. They have to start somewhere. They have to start with one of them, and the first one they release that isn't meant to work in the like reaction focused ones is gonna stand there alone with no other field time carry to play them with. And that's the reality, is Navia's just the first one of these short field time carries. They could just decide, hey, we'll never release another one after this. You don't get to have fun, right? They could, but I don't think that's very likely, and I think that the more likely outcome is they'll release Navia, and eventually they'll release another character that works very well with Navia, that wants to be played with the same supports, and that also does something with field time in a way that can capitalize on the buffs you're getting from those supports. With Navia, obviously, if you really like her character, you can still go for her. I'd be a little bit more prudent in the expectation that she could get stronger with upcoming releases, because it could take a while. So if you are planning to maybe go for her with the assumption that she'll get better, it may be better to hold off until a rerun. That's enough of how she can work with other potential future stuff. Let's talk about what she works with right now. Because there is currently in the game a character that is Navia-like. It's just that it's not a very good character. I've been doing a bit of Ning testing today, and man, this character is not good. Ningguang has a very similar dynamic to Navia, where at the start of her field time, her output is much stronger than it is later on in her field time. You can do EQE charge attack with C6 and you front load a lot of your damage. The problem is, if you look at her as a character that can spend a lot of time on field, her DPS is pretty bad because once she gets her front loaded stuff out, when she does an EQ charge attack E, after that she's just normal and charge attacking, and that DPS is just not great. Which means that the best use of her kit is in a way that where you front load your damage. Now, the problem is the way that she's balanced is around a 12-second cooldown. And a lot of the buffs in the game don't last long enough for you to do 2 instances of your front loaded stuff, but also have cooldowns that are too long to realistically just do 12-second rotations with her. Which leaves you in a pretty awkward spot where you kinda end up either doing, not getting buffs for half of your things, or significantly slowing down her instances of high damage because you only do it every 20 seconds. And when that's what happens in either of those situations, it's just not great. Even if you were to have an optimal scenario for her, you still have the issue that she's struggling to reach that threshold for front-loaded characters where it actually does more damage than if you were to use a non-front-loaded character in their place. What that means is you will be able to use her with Navia, and it will be one of the teams that synergizes the best with Navia's role and what she does. But at the end of the day, it's not all about synergy. It's also about how good the thing actually is. And the reality is that, unfortunately, Ning's performance is lacking, which means that the team overall will be just fine from what I've seen. Let's get into the constellations. Constellation 1, a lady's rules for keeping a courteous distance, whatever. Each charge of crystal shrapnel consumed when Navia uses her skill will restore 3 energy to her and decrease the cooldown of her burst by 1 second. Up to 9 energy can be gained this way, and the cooldown of her burst can be decreased by up to 3 seconds. I assume this is per skill, so that means you could reduce burst cooldown by 6 seconds to 9 seconds. That doesn't really matter, I don't think, because it wouldn't be able to let you do 2 bursts per rotation. I don't think the cooldown change matters much. The energy refund is nice though. I mean, 18 less energy. It basically makes her Yara requirements disappear. So that's cool. I think it's maybe on the weaker side for Constellation 1s. The President's Pursuit of Victory. Each charge of her skill consume increases the crit rate of her skill by 12% up to 36. In addition, when the skill hits, you get a hit from the burst. Up to 1 instance of her burst can be triggered per skill, and the damage is considered burst damage. That's the second part doesn't matter. It adds 73 motion value, so it doesn't really matter. So it's basically 36% crit rate on the skill, 72 CV. That's nice. That being said, though, if you're playing her with Farina, Maréchaussée, her signature weapon is crit rate. You do have to be careful that you're not overcapped on crit. It is still doable because her signature is 22, so 27 with the base crit rate, another 36. That brings you to 63. So with this, you're basically at 100%, right? 99.1. So crit rate and subs becomes completely useless. I think it's fairly likely that you're gonna, if you are playing her with Farina and her signature, you're gonna get maybe closer to 25-ish in best case scenario, because I think it's very unlikely that you're gonna have no crit rate in your artifacts. It's still all right though. It's a fine C2. C3 increases skill damage by 3. That's obviously pretty good because a good portion of her damage is skill. C4, when your burst hits an opponent, it shreds geo resistance. That's pretty all right. That being said, if you're playing her in a a team with Zhongli, it doesn't do that much because you're already shredding, but if you're playing her solo Geo, it's a pretty big deal. So it's a nice constellation, but it's not like a huge increase. Increased burst levels, which is fine because some of her damage comes from burst, but it's not a majority. It's like at most a third. It's fine. And then C6, if more than 3 stacks are consumed when using her E, then each charge beyond the first 3 increases crit damage by 45%. And charges consumed beyond the first 3 are returned to Navia. What that means is if you get to 6 shards, you gain 135 crit damage, and instead of costing you all 6, it only costs 3. So you still have 3 after using it. I mean, that's a C6. It's pretty good. But my brain is going, like, you'd be able to benefit a lot more from this with Sac than with the other weapons, wouldn't you? Is it gonna make it so that her best slotted C6 is Sac? No, probably not. But maybe if you're running her with Farina, because Verdict and Serpent Spine, both of her best weapons, if you're running with Bennett Farina, both of them are crit rate. So if you go Maréchaussée, you can lose a lot of value from the crit rate from both of them, because you can overcap very easily. But yeah, so that's it for Constellations. Let's talk about her ER requirements. I'm going to use this team as the default. You get 2 E's. You have maybe 3 of Xiangling's Globus particles being caught by her, 1 not caught, the Bennett stuff, and then you have Zhongli's particles, which are kind of unreliable. Let's say you get 1 off field and 2 on field. That leaves you with ER requirements around 140, assuming you go Fav on Zhongli and no Fav on Xiangling. If we look at some of the worst and best case scenarios, right? I think technically Zhongli can generate a particle every 4 seconds. Yeah, it's 50% every 2 seconds, assuming the pillar somehow doesn't break. So that's up to 5 particles per rotation. And then if you also have Fab on Xiangling, brings her ER requirements as low as around 115. And if you look at more worst case scenario, your pillar breaks instantly, so Zhongli doesn't generate anything, and you get unlucky on her skill generation up to around 170 with your pillar breaks and you get unlucky particles, right? 175. Realistically, I think what you're gonna want to get is like 150 to 160 is gonna be relatively safe, but obviously there can still be situations where things just go wrong. Anyways, her ER requirements in a team like this tend to revolve around this. ER requirements can go up quite a bit if you're playing her in teams that generate less energy with characters that are more energy black holes than generators, and it can be lower if you're playing characters that generate more energy. And overall, her ER requirements are going to range anywhere between like 110, 115 to 180, 190, with them most of the time being around 140, 150. That means that weapons that give ER are going to be somewhat valuable because she can actually take advantage of that ER. Pretty similar to weapons on Ella, where a weapon like Scoured Pride is actually a pretty good option within the 5-star options because, well, the passive is pretty useful for her, but also you're not wasting the substat like you are if you were to use Scoured Pride on a character that doesn't need the ER. Here's the thing though, her elemental skill is the main portion of her damage, and her ER requirements are not trivial. What that means is that a weapon like Sacrificial Greatsword is actually going to be pretty good for her. Now, there are some caveats to that, and they're pretty important. Navia's skill has 2 charges. If you use 2 skills, it's going to take 18 seconds for both of your skills to come back. If you use her skill 17 seconds later, while there's still a little bit of cooldown left to the second charge, then instead of effectively giving you 1 more charge, it's just going to set this 0.5 cooldown remaining for the charge that you're about to get to 0, and you're effectively not going to gain anything. So that's caveat number 1. Number 2, you can't get a 100% chance to proc on Sac. Her skill does have a lot of different bullets, but from my understanding, that doesn't count as multiple different hits, so it's still only 1 chance to proc. She has something in her kit that alleviates that, though. The Uzia hit that you get when you use your skill can actually proc Sac. It doesn't apply any element, right? Uzia and Pneuma hits do not apply any element, but it is still skill damage, and as such, it can trigger your Sac Greatsword, which means that effectively, her skill is a multi-hit. But because of the issue I mentioned earlier, if you don't proc it on the first one and you proc it on the second one instead, it's gonna mean that on your next rotation, things are delayed, because you get your cooldown reset on, like, while you've already effectively used up some of the cooldown. which is going to make it so that you have to wait a bit longer for the next one. With those caveats out of the way, if you have a high refined Sac Greatsword, and I do mean high refined, at low refined I don't think it's very good because you have to wait for the cooldown of the Sac Greatsword, which is at R1 30 seconds, and that doesn't line up with rotations very well. I think R3 is the bare minimum for it to be an actual good option on her. But if you are using Sac Greatsword, it actually makes it a lot easier to reach your ER requirements, which makes her reliance on either another geo unit or just in general other units that generate energy a lot lower. And because of that, the fact that she works very well with a high refined Sac sword, I think makes one of the teams that I had previously mostly discounted a lot stronger. And that's with Bennett, Xiangling, Farina. And yeah, I know, it's just national again. You can't escape it. Using Sac effectively, it slightly extends her field time because, well, you get one more skill, so that's more time you spend on field, but not so much that you would use up all of Bennett's burst. And what that means is you can still get your Bennett burst healing on the rest of your character and the snapshot on Xiangling, right? Without really losing relevant uptime on her, which means you can stack up Farina's passive without losing relevant uptime on her. And the main upside of a team like this is the units you're playing buff her damage a decent amount, but also have pretty good personal damage. Farina's personal damage when you're forward vaping her, which is going to be what's happening in a team like this, is nothing to scoff at. Like it's pretty good damage. I think you can also use it with like Kazuha Farina. I don't know if I like it quite as much though, because I think you're not going to get your vapes on Farina as reliably, and well, Kazuha is not increasing Navia's damage, it's only increasing Farina's damage, so I don't know if I like it quite as much, but it is another thing you could do. All this to say, right, the way that Sac works on her, it means that in some teams, Sac is going to be arguably her best weapon, but only at high refine. And that's one of those things that it's weird, right? Because I think the difference between an R3 Sac and an R5 Sac is going to be incredibly noticeable. If you have R3 on Sac, it has a 60% chance to proc on skill damage. Now, because you get 2 hits, it's an 84% chance to proc. That means that 1 in 6 times, 1/6 of your rotations, you're not going to get the proc and you're going to be sitting there like a dumbass, just unhappy. R3 is also 22-second cooldown, so you have to make sure that you actually do a full 22-second rotation, which can be a bit scuffed. And you can just retry if it happens, but there's the possibility that it happens on the second rotation, which is cringe. At R2, not only is it 1 in 4 times instead of 1 in 6 that it happens, but the cooldown is also 26 seconds. And you don't want to do 26-second rotations. Like, at that point, the Sac isn't doing much, because if you were to do a 27-second rotation, you could get 3 E's anyways. And if you actually stay on her, like you do E, 4 normal attacks, E, 4 normal attacks, that's almost 9 seconds, so your E's like kind of back off cooldown anyways, right? So if you can do 26-ish second rotations, then the Sac Greatsword isn't doing much for you. But like, it really needs to be R3+, and even the difference between R3, 1 in 6 times you're gonna have to reset, and well, because generally you don't clear in 1 rotation, then it's gonna happen even more often. R4, it's 1 in 11 times, right? So the difference between R4 and R5, it basically happens half as often. And R5, it's 1 in 25 times. That makes it so that if you have a high refined Sac Greatsword versus a low refined Sac Greatsword, it significantly changes how good the weapon is on her. Hello YouTube, this is the Jeff from a few days later. I just wanted to add a few things. The fact that her E has multiple charges allows for some front-loading bullshit that can effectively make her a lot stronger in some situations, especially at higher investment. So the idea behind this is basically, on your first rotation, because if you use your E and then you auto for a little bit and then your E for your second charge and you auto for a little bit, the animation for both of those E's and all of those autos is about 9 seconds, and that's the cooldown for your E. So you can get a third E on that first rotation if you start with 2 charges. But that can't happen on the second rotation, because if you use 3 charges like that, you'd have to have a 27-second rotation, which is honestly too long, so that you would restart the next rotation with 2 charges up. So the next rotation, if you do this, you're going to start with 1 charge up instead of 2. The thing about this is, in the right situations, it is realistic to clear Abyss in 1.5 to 2 rotations, even at the sort of investment I usually look at, which is what a casual-ish player who watches guides to know how to build their characters can get to if they play the game somewhere between 3 and 5 times a week and they don't spend like all of their resin. And the reality is, like, once you start reaching that level of investment, getting stronger takes exponentially more and more time. So there's just not that huge of a difference between that and an actually fairly well optimized player with like free-to-play level investment who doesn't go for constellations and stuff like that. Anyways, you can very much reach thresholds where Abyss Chambers are 1.5 to 2 rotationable. And in those situations, Navia can significantly overperform because, right, as we've talked about throughout this pre-release, most of her damage comes from her skill. And even if you use more generous assumptions that spend more time on her using her normal attacks that are geo-infused, it's still pretty close to half of her damage that's from the skill. So getting one more skill in your rotation is a pretty big deal in terms of how much damage you're doing. Now the DPS doesn't change because all you're doing is you're basically borrowing the next rotation's damage and inserting it into the first one. But if that first one or that first 1.5 is enough to kill the enemy, then you're borrowing from a rotation that would never happen anyway, so you are effectively gaining it. This leads Navia teams to having the same sort of effect as the child teams, where their ability to front load damage with Child's Burst makes it so that they can pretty significantly overperform their like sheet DPS in the right circumstances. And Navia does have that ability of front loading damage into her first rotation by doing a triple E first rotation. I've talked about Sac Greatsword, and with Sac Greatsword you could do a 4E first rotation. But a 4E first rotation with Sac Greatsword is not as significant as a 3E first rotation with another weapon because, well, 4 divided by 3 is 33% more skill damage, and 3 divided by 2 is 50% more. So it's overall less impactful on Sac to use this, which is something that I should have taken more into account when I did the weapon section initially, because I do think this is something that will happen fairly often. And also, I know that not every person who watches my videos is only focused on Abyss, right? Which is why I try to talk about quality of life that applies outside of Abyss. Overworld enemies will never live longer than 1 rotation. And so Navia's ability to front load damage in her first rotation matters even more in Overworld and in domains, stuff like that. And it also helps you get your energy back because obviously you do 1 more E, that's more energy you're generating, and that is a pretty significant thing. So all of this to say, right, Navia does have a bunch of things going for her outside of strictly like sheet DPS stuff that can make her overperform in some situations, and it is important to mention. Do I think that's enough to make her WoW Omega broken? Yeah! No. But it definitely does help her a lot, and I think will lead to overall community perception of her to be pretty positive. That paired with the fact that her damage is very much screenshot damage. So much of her damage comes from a big number in one ability hit. We've seen the same effect with Ella. That's definitely going to be a thing that will also lead to overall community perception of Navia being more positive. But I think in her case, while not meta breaking, she is definitely good enough that an overall positive reaction is justified. Even though I do expect it to be a bit inflated by YouTube clickbait to some extent. Anyways, let's talk about her weapons properly. Verdict, which is her signature option. Wow, cool axe. I think it looks pretty cool. I don't think it is very good. So let me explain. I think in a lot of teams with Navia, you're gonna want to get, or you're gonna end up with a lot of external attack buffs. I think you're gonna play her with Bennett in most of her teams, like most of her like better teams. Bennett in her teams is basically always gonna have Noblesse. You're gonna get 2 stacks of her passive in most of her teams, so that's another 40% attack. That leaves you with a lot of attack. And because of that, the fact that this weapon is high base attack and gives you some attack in the passive means that it loses a little bit of value. And when you actually look at the numbers, in the situations where you get the most attack, which is the team that I mentioned earlier, right? The Bennett, Zhongli, Xiangling, Verdict is about as good as R5 Serpent Spine. ever so slightly better, and those two are her two best options, but compared to other signature 5 stars, very underwhelming. In Ts where you run less external attack buffs, maybe you're not running Bennett, it becomes a much stronger option. And I do think there is some Navia teams that you'll play that aren't going to really want Bennett, but at least so far, I'm really drawn towards the teams that do use Bennett more than the teams that don't. So what it does is it's high base attack, low crit rate, or crit rate substat. It gives you 20% attack, and when you trigger Crystallize, you gain skill damage, 36% if you trigger it twice. In terms of like how many stats you get out of the stat stick, it's pretty average, and obviously as a general weapon, it's not great on anyone who isn't skill focused, but it's still fine if they're attack scalers. But yeah, like I said, right, because it's high base attack and part of it's the passive is attack percent, it makes it so that if you run a lot of external attack buffs, it becomes worse. So, all in all, the verdict on the verdict is that it's technically best in slot, but often not worth. And then you can take a look at the other 5-star options. What this all boils down to is, because of how good Sac Greatsword can be, I think these 4 options, if you have an R5 Sac Greatsword, aren't really worth considering. On top of that, they're not that much better than the event weapon that is coming out next patch. Ultimate Overlord's Mega Magic Sword, that is a high base attack, ER substat. R5 increases your attack by 48%, but you need to have done exploration and questing for it, so make sure you do that. Bacon, decent, 5-star stat stick. Same for Red Horn. Wolves, Unforged, and Song of Broken Pine, so not Skyward Pride. If you're running in teams that do not have a lot of external attack buffs, are a lot better and start becoming more or less competitive with Bacon and Red Horn as 5-star options. But even then, it's not necessarily better than the 4-star options. Other than that, right, the event weapon that's coming is going to be her best like free-to-play option that you can guarantee, right? So event weapon, I'm not typing the name, best in slot free-to-play. Other than that, obviously you have Serpent Spine, which is going to be best in slot 4-star sometimes. And then you have Sacrificial Greatsword, High Refine, best in slot sometimes. Sometimes it's even better than her signature. I mean, okay, in teams where the ER requirements are a lot higher, it probably is. Sacrificial Greatsword, low refine, it's okay. It's not great. And then if you're watching this, you haven't done the event, you're watching this when the event is gone, whatever. Her next best free-to-play option is the Tidal Shadow if you can proc the passive. So Tidal Shadow, decent free-to-play if you can proc it. It relies on you getting healed, so you have to make sure that you can actually heal. With Bennett, you're going to have to make sure that you're under 70% HP, so you actually do heal. The new Battle Pass, the Talking Stick, is just worse than Serpent Spine in basically every scenario. That being said, though, it is worth noting, Serpent Spine, I mean, better than 5-star stat sticks in teams where you stack a lot of attack. But yeah, so overall, right, her like weapon order, I'd put Verdict first, then Serpent Spine, then Bacon and Red Horn, then High Refined Sac, with the caveat that in some teams it might actually just be the best weapon. Then, yeah, probably these 4 all together. Then Event Weapon, then Sac Greatsword, then Tidal Shadow probably. But yeah, all of this to say, right? Sac Greatsword is just so much better than I thought it would. And again, right? Keep in mind, this is a pre-release. I haven't done any testing on it. I feel like I'm going crazy because I haven't seen anyone talk about it. And the calcs that I've done have it like actually really good. I know I'm cooking. I have no idea if what I'm cooking is edible. So do take it with a huge grain of salt because I am not confident in this whatsoever. Obviously, keep in mind, right? If you are actually spending the time to get the stacks on your skill for the additional E you get, that increases her field time. What I looked at was, assuming you just do your second E instantly with no additional stacks, I think there's definitely the possibility that you do some weird like EN3, EN3E. I'm not very confident about this, but anyways, I will be testing this on day one, 100%. So if you use the pre-releases as a way to like gather information, if you're not sure, if you're on the fence about wishing, even before the patch drops, I'll be live on Twitch, so you can drop by and I'll be testing it. Next, artifact sets. Nighttime Whispers in the Echoing Woods. Best in slot, generally in non-Farina teams. Briochebun, best in slot with Farina. And then you can go 2-piece, or I'm not going to include them in the sheet, but like you could go like Lava Walker if you're playing the team with Bennett Chengling. You could go, I guess, 4-piece Petra, but like, you could go Golden Troop technically, but I'm not a huge fan. I mean, if for some reason you're playing her in a team with like Fischl, you can play Thunder Soother, I guess. And then your 2-piece is like either Geo Damage. You can go 2-piece Golden Troop, I guess. Just like you can go 4-piece Golden Troop, but it's like, you know? You can go 2-piece Attack set. You can go 2-piece ER set. Kind of just whatever. It's fine while you're farming for the new set, or if you just don't want to bother with the new set. Yeah, I guess I'll mention 4-piece Petra set. The reality is that most teams that actually benefit or would potentially benefit from the 2-piece Petra have a decent amount of their damage snapshotted at moments where you don't really proc Petra, or you don't really get the shard while she's on field. And it leads to weird rotation stuff that I don't really like, so I'm not a big fan of it, but it's a thing you can do, I guess. Artifact stats. Attack, Geo, crit. There may be some Farina teams where you're not running Bennett, where attack crit is fine, but that's going to be very rare. If you're running her in a solo Geo team with relatively low particle generation and you're not running a weapon that gives you ER, you can go ER Geo crit, but I think it's so situational that I'm not going to include it. I think it's mainly just attack Geo crit. And then finally, we look at teams. The more I think about it, the more I like the Navia National. I don't like Navia National. Like that's kind of boring, you know? National Swift. I guess it's Naviational. I don't know. I think it's boring, but I can't come up with something better. Naviational. Good. I think even if Sac Sword doesn't end up working out like I think it will, it's still just going to be a decent team because you can't go wrong with Changling. I do think this is a team that actually does benefit quite a bit from using Farina, because like you could just use Singto and like forward or reverse vape Changling, like the traditional national stuff, but without an Animo unit that doesn't matter as much, and Farina increases the damage that Navia herself is doing by a pretty big amount, because you're not just getting the damage percent from her, you're also getting a better artifact set because you can use Maréchaussée. Are we sure Changling is better than Yelan in that slot? I think so, because you get less fanfare with Yelan because she scales with HP, so you build her HP, so you won't heal as big of a portion of her health with Bennett, and you don't get to vape any of Farina's stuff versus a pretty decent portion of it. And this is not a team with like only one main source of damage, so Yelan's buff isn't that huge of a deal. You also lose Power Resonance, but you get Hydro Resonance. I do think it'll be better with Changling. I think it'll be fine with Yelan for sure, though. I mean, we can mention it, though. Double Hydro with Bennett. It's gonna be good. Hot Rock. Gonna be good. You can do like quote-unquote hyper, but it's not really hyper because you're still getting damage from Farina. But with Bennett, Zhongli, Farina, where you focus basically exclusively on her output, it's gonna be all right. I don't think it'll be as good as her other options. It'll still be fine though. Maybe it does get to good. I don't know. I don't think any of her teams are going to be like insanely strong. The options that she does have are going to be pretty decent. Like they're going to be good. They're just, you know, not going to be on any like meta breaking, any like insanely broken stuff. Now you can look at teams with Farina without Bennett, right? So you're looking at Farina, Jean, Zhongli, Farina, Jean, Yelan. I think they're going to be all right. They're not going to be like cope, but they're also not going to be great. I think that's it for the teams where like I could see her being a good slot. I don't like her in Hyperbloom. I think most Hyperbloom teams don't tend to have high enough uptime on elements that are not Dendron enemies that she can reliably trigger a lot of Crystallizes. She will struggle to actually trigger Crystallizes in a lot of Hyperbloom teams. It's not going to be a problem in Burgeon teams because the Dendro aura isn't just Dendro, it's a burning aura, so you can trigger off of the pyro part of burning, but you can't do that in Hyperbloom. I think she can be like fine in Burgeon, but great, no real synergy with it. Yeah, I guess also with like Noelle or Ito. I think Ito's field time requirements are a bit too high for him to synergize well, but it'll be okay. I like it a little bit more with Noelle. You can do something with like Noelle, Farina, Yelan, or something like that. But that's just, again, right, like that's a Farina team without Bennett. I think it works fine. I think in that kind of team, you're definitely more incentivized to run something like Sac Sword. I haven't mentioned Ning because I just don't think that double carry team with Ning is going to be particularly good. I think it's just going to feel very underwhelming. It'll clear content, but it's going to feel worse than using the other Geo units, I think. That being said, though, let us actually talk about her synergy with the Geo units, because not everyone has Zhongli. Yunjin, not very good, because you don't do a lot of normal attacks on her. Goro, also not great. His defense buff does basically nothing. His Geo damage buff is pretty small. You don't tend to want to play Navia in triple Geo teams, so you don't get, even if he's C6, you don't get the full 40 crit damage. You only get, what is it, 28? No, it's 20. Wow. Gora's synergy with her is not great. So I guess that leaves you with Noelle that I've already talked about, Zhongli, Albedo, Ning, and I guess GeoMC. You can use GeoMC. I think the synergy's fine, but GeoMC is just not a great character, a bit like Ning. I talked about Ning a little bit. It works. Like, the synergy's there, but the numbers kind of aren't. And then you have Albedo, which is actually a pretty reasonable option. He has similar issues to Zhongli, where sometimes his flower just breaks because enemy boss hitboxes are a pain in the ass. But if you aim it backwards a little bit, it's easier to get the energy generation without it breaking, right? Because with Zhongli, you have to be, the pillar needs to be close enough to the enemy that it hits, but not so close that it gets broken by boss hitbox. With Albedo, the range is bigger, so it's easier to get it in a position where it doesn't break. You're basically trading the 20% res shred from Zhongli for a little bit more personal damage. But again, right, more and more, the more I think about it, the more I look at the numbers, I am kind of drawn towards the solo Geo Sac Greatsword teams. If you have a high refined Sac, I think they're actually going to be pretty decent. But yeah, that basically does it for the pre-release. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you learned a thing or two. Really hope I'm not coping really hard with the Sac Greatsword, because I think it'd be nice to actually have, finally, after 3.5 years almost, a character that can actually use Sac Greatsword where it isn't cope. Yeah, as usual, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know if you think I'm coping with the Sac Greatsword. I'll try to leave a pinned comment on day one for those of you that can't catch the stream or just don't want to bother looking on Twitch. As usual, I'll try to post a pre-release before the banner is over, as well as the first impressions video. So stick around for that, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.